This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, in a significant escalation in events in the Middle East, in Lebanon, and in Palestine, Israel has assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, the Deputy General of Hezbollah, together with a lot of his top leaders. This is a dramatic escalation. It's an assault on international law. Israel also killed hundreds of Lebanese civilians in the middle of Beirut, and despite this assassination, continues to drop bombs throughout the south and within the borders of the Lebanese capital in Beirut. Meanwhile, the bloodshed in Gaza and the starvation and the ongoing war and genocide in Gaza continue unabated. This is a dramatic escalation, Jamal. We're going to be covering all those events today on Arab Talk, together with the really bizarre, if not kind of catastrophic development that appears that Benjamin Netanyahu, from his address at the United Nations to an essentially empty hall at the UN, telegraphed his intention to assassinate the Hezbollah leader. And in fact, it appears that he may have gotten permission from the United States. We're going to be covering that. We're also going to be covering the ongoing developments in terms of its impact on this assassination throughout the Arab world and in the United States, talking about its implications in Palestine and Lebanon. And before we get to these dramatic developments, Jamal, we're going to see and hear an interview that you did with Juliette Touma. She's the UNRWA's Director of Communications, in discussing the organization's challenges in trying to deliver aid to the most dangerous places in the world for NGOs in Gaza and to administer the multi-stage polio vaccines to over 600,000 children in Gaza who are facing starvation. It's an incredibly important interview, and it should be watched by all.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct, Jess. And we just remind our listeners and viewers that UNRWA says that more than 200 of its staff members have been killed by Israel in Gaza. Recently, also, a UNHRC employee in Lebanon was killed. Maybe the numbers even are much higher than this. And they also face financial difficulties because the United States had cut funding to UNRWA. Let's watch the interview with Juliette Touma. The first autumn rains arrived in Gaza, flooding crowded encampments and soaking the few provisions Palestinian refugees there had. In some cases, the tarps were swept away, leaving people with no shelter at all. As Israel continues to bombard infrastructure and Palestinians in Gaza, the need for humanitarian aid is burgeoning. An alarming development has been the detection of polio, and a subsequent accelerated program of vaccination is being administered for children under 10 in Gaza. When the United Nations General Assembly met this week, heads of UN agencies such as UNICEF and the World Health Organization issued a statement saying they cannot do their jobs in Gaza in the face of overwhelming need and ongoing violence. Philip Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, stated that Israel has stopped giving visas to heads and staff of the international NGO community. The implications of these actions are difficult to fathom, where resources are already almost non-existent and people struggling to address enormous human need. Joining us on Arab Talk to discuss this and more is Juliette Touma, UNRWA's Director of Communications. UNRWA is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, the fundamental source and liaison for humanitarian aid in Gaza. Welcome to Arab Talk, Juliette.
Thanks for having me, Jamal.
Israel does not allow international journalists to report in Gaza. You've been there during this war and are constantly updated by UNRWA staff there. Describe the current devastation there and how dire the need is.
Okay, it's very, very difficult to put words to what I've seen in Gaza. This war has had a devastating impact on the people of Gaza and on the urban settings in Gaza and on basic services, and also on cultural life and on civil life in Gaza. At UNRWA, we also had our share. First of all, I will start with mourning our colleagues that were killed during the war. To date, we have 224 of our team members who have been killed since the war started in Gaza. That's a huge, huge loss for an agency like ours, for any organization. And it is the highest death toll that the United Nations has ever recorded since we started working at the end of the 1940s. In addition to that, the damage that this war has had on our buildings, on our facilities. So 2/3 of our buildings have been hit. Some have been directly hit. Some have been hit twice, 3 times or more. Many of those buildings were used as shelters for displaced families. And as a result, more than 560 people were killed while they were taking refuge under the UN flag. We have called so many times for a ceasefire, for respite for the people of Gaza, and our calls have been for almost a year now falling on deaf ears.
The polio vaccination program, UNRWA is involved in administering a multi-stage vaccine to over 600,000 children under 10, under the most difficult circumstances, as you've been describing, including having the medical convoys targeted by Israel en route. Was the first phase successful, and what were the challenges to carrying it out?
Very successful against all odds and against all the challenges that we have faced. First of all, to undertake such a huge campaign to vaccinate 600,000 kids is not easy at all in peaceful times. So imagine doing this during war and during an ongoing conflict like we have in Gaza. Together with the World Health Organization and with UNICEF, UNRWA played a lead role in putting those very precious drops in the mouth of children. And that we have completed, and we have reached 90% of the children that we aim to reach. And you're absolutely right. On one of the days towards the end of the campaign, as one of our convoys was headed to northern Gaza, Gaza City, with a group of medical teams, the convoy was stopped by the Israeli forces at an Israeli-controlled checkpoint for 8 hours. They were held at gunpoint. There were threats to our staff to be arrested. There were bulldozers that came on those armored cars that we use in conflict settings around the world, which I'm sure you know are very expensive cars, and it's very, very difficult to get them into Gaza. And the convoy had to return back to the base, luckily, safely. Our staff were not harmed, at least not physically, but everybody was shaken. And despite that, we were able to undertake phase 3, which is to reach children in northern Gaza and Gaza City. Now, all of that happened thanks to joint cooperation between the different United Nations agencies to bring in the vaccine, to protect what we call the cold chain, and then heavy negotiations with parties to the conflict so that they give what they called area pauses, which meant that every time we had the campaign being rolled out in a certain part of Gaza, there would be a pause in the violence, right? And that helped us a lot. And that helped people a lot. The communities were not afraid to come to our clinics, our mobile teams. At UNRWA, we're going from tent to tent, from shelter to shelter to reach children with the vaccines. Now, all of this was fantastic. We have to do this campaign all over again. in a few weeks' time. And we do hope that we get the same commitment from the parties to the conflict, and that we don't have any security incidents, and that the communities, the fathers and the mothers, would be encouraged to bring their children to get the second dose of the vaccine. That's the only way to control such a vicious virus like polio is. It's a virus that doesn't know borders. It's a virus that doesn't differentiate between children based on their nationality, their geographic location. It travels very, very quickly. So the only way to protect children is to have the vaccines.
Just to understand this, to make this clear, there is a short window after the first inoculation. Like, how short is this window? Like, when exactly, or how many weeks after?
4 to 6 weeks time. So we're hoping that at the end of this month or by mid-October that we're able to do the same all over again with the children. It depends on when can we get the vaccines into Gaza. Are the fighting parties going to give us the same commitments that they have in the stage 1 of the campaign? It depends on bringing in the cold chain, which is the fridges and the cool boxes that are conditional to protecting the vaccine under a certain temperature. So it depends on all these factors. And these pauses that we had, Jamal, over the past weeks when we did the first phase of the campaign, these pauses do not replace our calls for a ceasefire. They were a technical step and a show of goodwill that were put in place. And what we're saying is that since there was that goodwill to do this pause, then it's not impossible to have a long-term ceasefire.
So from what I read, Israel is stopping visas for the heads and staff of humanitarian non-governmental organizations in an already dire humanitarian crisis. How can this be? I mean, you've mentioned you need to administer this vaccine pretty soon. So how are you going to do that if they're stopping people from entering?
The humanitarian situation in Gaza and increasingly in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is worsening by the day. So the logic says that we need more humanitarian workers, not less humanitarian workers, given the vast humanitarian needs and the dependence on organizations like UNRWA and other United Nations agencies and international non-governmental organizations, the dependence of the people on assistance coming from these organizations. But sadly, what we've been seeing since the war began on the 7th of October last year is we've seen a decrease in the visas that the Israeli authorities grant to humanitarian workers, a decrease in granting the visa to begin with, or shortening the length of the visa. So, for example, normally a UN worker would get 1 year. Now we're getting a duration of 1 to 3 months, sometimes 6 months if it's a best case scenario. And that really limits the work of United Nations agency and restricts the work of United Nations agencies. When it comes to the NGOs, their heads have not been getting visas. And so that also has implications on what we call the humanitarian footprint and the ability of the humanitarian community to serve people who need us most, including in Gaza, but also in the occupied West Bank.
Has Philip Lazzarini, UNRWA's Commissioner General, been able to visit Gaza and meet with staff there?
He has. He was the first senior United Nations official to set foot in Gaza after the war began. He was able to visit Gaza. I accompanied him on a number of those visits 4 times. And then he was hoping to get in to Gaza again in March, when the Israeli authorities denied him entry to Gaza. He tried again in May and in July, so he was in total denied 3 times from entering Gaza. And since the 10th of June, the Israeli authorities have not renewed his visa to enter the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem.
So just a couple of weeks ago, first week of September, children all over the world started school, except in Gaza. UNRWA released a report then entitled Education Under Attack, Restoring Learning for Children in Gaza. This will be the second year for some children not being able to attend school there. Gaza has a very high international rate of literacy, over 97%. Talk about this.
Look, I think what's been happening in Gaza in terms of human indicators is phenomenal. We have had, as one example, a semi-universal rate of vaccination against diseases among children. And that is incredible under the circumstances that Gazan children were vaccinated at that date. This is equivalent, if not higher, than some countries in Europe, and certainly higher than the United States in some parts of it. And the same applies, you're absolutely right, to education and to literacy and to enrollment, what we call enrollment rates of learning. In Gaza, UNRWA was providing more than 300,000 boys and girls with education in some 200 schools that we managed and we ran. And children have not been going to school for more than a year now. Children across Gaza, so over 650,000 kids have not been to school. And this should be an extreme priority and a top priority for anyone around the world who cares about education and who cares about children, because we know from previous conflicts, not just in Gaza, but in other parts of the region and around the world, that the longer that children spend time out of school, first of all, from a technical perspective, the more difficult it is for them to catch up on what they lost. And we know that far too well with every child, and almost every child in the world had to go through this during COVID. The education losses is something that continues to be felt by parents, by teachers, by education personnel 4 years down the line. Children have not been able to really catch up on what they lost during the lockdown time in COVID. So the same applies to children in conflict. Very, very difficult to catch up on education losses. And the other big risk is that the longer children stay out of school and out of the classroom and out of learning is the higher the risk for them to fall prey into exploitation. And that is a multifold range of risks to a child. That includes being more subjected to domestic violence or gender-based violence, early marriage, especially among girls, but also in the context of wars and conflict, like we have in Gaza, recruitment into armed groups and militias as one example.
I'd like to pivot to what has been a campaign by Israel to delegitimize UNRWA and stop its funding with many baseless accusations. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, spoke publicly during an interview where he unequivocally dismissed many of Israel's accusations as lies. How damaging was the stall in international funding and support for UNRWA due to Israel's myth-truths?
Extremely damaging. Extremely damaging. It is safe to say that the agency has been subjected to a barrage of misinformation and disinformation as part of a wider campaign to dismantle UNRWA. And the common thread in that campaign was the neutrality and accusations that either the agency is not abiding by the neutrality humanitarian principle of the United Nations, which is a very big accusation, and then our staff, and then that our programs were not aligned with that humanitarian principle. The damage is extensive. It continues to be extensive. It is multi-factor, if you wish, because it goes from damage that has been done to the reputation of the agency, an agency that has at its core the delivery of human development services to one of the most vulnerable groups in the world, which is Palestinian refugees. And then into the funding of the agency. Back in January, when we have taken the responsibility to announce publicly that we have received very serious accusations about the behavior of members of our staff, a very, very short number, I should say, of our staff. We have announced that publicly, and we said that we're launching an investigation through the United Nations in New York, independent to UNRWA, and that we have taken the extraordinary decision through our Commissioner General to terminate the contracts of these staff members. Despite that, and despite owning it, and despite going publicly before anyone else, by the way, we had in 48 hours over a weekend, 16 donor countries, including our largest donors, put an end to, or suspend, more accurate, suspend temporarily the funding to the agency. So if you ask me this question about the sheer survival of the agency back in January, and I have said it myself, including to the media, is UNRWA was on its deathbed. And we were not sure whether we are able to continue delivering our services beyond the end of January. And obviously, the biggest concern for us was, what are we going to do with our operations in Gaza in the middle of a war like this, and as the humanitarian needs continue to increase by the day?
I believe it's been several months since all the countries have restored their funding and support for UNRWA, except for the United States. However, a bill was proposed in Congress very recently to reinstate funding and support UNRWA's mission. How critical is the support of the United States?
Absolutely critical. The United States has been the top donor to this agency for decades, since the establishment of this agency almost 75 years ago now. It has been a very, very generous partner and donor to this agency, contributing to nearly half of the operational budget every year, with the exception of the time under President Donald Trump, where the United States has defunded the agency. And then we have seen a return of the funding under the current U.S. administration. It still makes half of our operational budget. And obviously, the lack of this funding stands in the way of us continuing. Hence, the lack of predictability of how much longer can this agency go, because we have managed, since January, we have managed to bring in additional resources or alternative resources, including through the private donations. So that's from individuals like yourself and myself, who have given us very generously. In fact, there is a great success story on that part, where we have managed to fundraise $150 million since the war began through private donations, including from individuals in the United States through our fundraising office, UNRWA USA, and others. We have also seen countries that have never been donors to the agency step forward, countries like Iraq, countries like Algeria, countries who have massively increased their donations, like Portugal, for example, or Norway or Ireland, among others. So this is how we managed to make do over the past few months, but this is not a healthy approach, and this is not a predictable approach. And so we are calling for a completely different funding model to this agency that gives multi-year and predictable funding to the agency for us to be able to continue providing the human development services, and right now emergency services in Gaza. And soon enough, I'm afraid we'll have to do something similar in places like Lebanon, given the recent escalation we've seen in the past week.
Do you think that there is a larger issue than funding in Israel's attempt to delegitimize UNRWA, such as erasing more of Palestine's historical legitimacy by eliminating their status as refugees?
I think that's the very core. The core of all these attempts to dismantle the agency is to strip the Palestinian people from their refugee status. But I think this is quite short-sighted in the long term, because even if UNRWA is closed down or dismantled, the Palestinian refugees will not lose their refugee status. The loss of closing UNRWA in the absence of an alternative is, as one example, more than 500,000 kids around the region will not be able to go to learning because it is extremely difficult to absorb these children in places, for example, like Syria, like Lebanon, like Jordan, in public school systems. That's just one example. Same goes for primary healthcare, right? So there is huge added value in the sheer existence of the agency in being a force of stability over the past decades in this region. And also, there is no question that there is no alternative right now to the work that UNRWA does in Gaza in the middle of this huge humanitarian catastrophe.
Is Gaza the most dangerous place in the world for UN or humanitarian staff to be working right now? And how is it that so many UN workers, and as you've mentioned, and I think the number is over 300 now in Gaza that got killed with impunity?
Look, Gaza has indeed become very quickly the most dangerous place to be a humanitarian aid worker in. The numbers are speaking for themselves, and let me just pause and say these are not just numbers. These are our colleagues and our friends and our team members. And with every life lost, in addition to the life itself, we've also lost a profession. We've lost a teacher. We've lost a nurse. We've lost one of the very, very few gynecologists in Gaza, as one example. We've lost engineers. We've lost support staff. So we've also had a brain drain because of the killing of UNRWA staff, among other professionals, by the way. So medical workers, journalists across the board in Gaza, and education workers who do not work with UNRWA. And so it has become very quickly the most dangerous place. And then the attacks on United Nations facilities, the number of times that humanitarian convoys were stopped or detoured or shot at on a number of occasions, including most recently just 10 days ago. So certainly, and by the way, it shouldn't be like this. Humanitarian workers must be protected at all times. And the parties to the conflict, in fact, have a duty to facilitate what we call humanitarian access, meaning our movement as humanitarians in order for us to be able to deliver relief and assistance to people who need us most. That's in line with international humanitarian law.
Israel claims that this is a war zone, and these deaths are just, I hate to say the word, just victims of that war. And we've seen what happened with the World Kitchen, and then they said it's a mistake. But do you think that Israel is deliberately targeting UNRWA staff and facilities?
Look, I really do not know the answer to this. And this is precisely why there should be, and we have been calling for that, there should be not one, but a series of investigations and commissions of inquiry and board of inquiry to look into all these violations of international humanitarian law. And because this has been unprecedented in the history of the United Nations, both the human toll on our staff, the damage and the destruction to United Nations facilities is unheard of. I mean, I always remember when we talk about 2014 war in Gaza, one colleague of mine told me we had one school that was hit in 2014. Now, 70% of our schools cannot be used because they've been hit, they've been damaged, and in some cases, they've been bombed out.
You've mentioned Lebanon, and we don't know what's going to happen, but things look very bad. And probably most people don't know also you operate in Lebanon, and there are Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syrian refugees. And so if this goes on, how will this complicate your work? I mean, overall and in Gaza in particular.
So you're absolutely right. We work in Lebanon, where we serve Palestinian refugees, mostly inside the refugee camps across the country. This will further add to the responsibility that we have towards Palestinian refugees, including in Lebanon. It is beyond concerning what's been happening in Lebanon over the past week. We just got the news that sadly 2 colleagues who work with UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, they were killed during the airstrikes yesterday. The call for a ceasefire across the board applies also for Lebanon, also for people in Israel, in North, in South, and also for Gaza. There is no way that anyone could win this war. There is only, and there should be only, a diplomatic solution for this crisis, for the sake of people, for the sake of civilians, among them many, many children.
Juliette Touma, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thanks for having me, Jamal.
That's the voice in the face of Juliette Touma, the UNRWA Director of Communications, discussing the challenges, the difficulties of administering not only food aid, but also medical aid in terms of the epidemic of polio in Gaza and the assault, not just on UNRWA, Jamal, from a financial standpoint, but the targeting of UNRWA officials by Israel, not just in Palestine, but also in Lebanon. UNRWA is facing some catastrophic situations right now, both financially and from its assault from Israel, Jamal. This is a very difficult development.
It is. I mean, they're working hard. They've been working basically since the Nakba and taking care of Palestinian refugees, education, health, food, etc. And now, basically Israel has been trying for years to delegitimize UNRWA and end its funding. And the goal from this is to try to basically erase the Palestinian refugee status, basically erase Palestinians, and that's the whole idea.
Right.
So at times they say, oh, they have Hamas members working for them, or UNRWA schools are used to hide munitions and weapons, which was proven to be proven to be lies. And so its survival is very important, especially now. I mean, especially now, that's the only organization that really can do any kind of work on the ground. We're moving on to the big story of this week, Jess, is the assassination of Hezbollah leader Sayyed Hassan Nasrallah and its implications. And we're getting more and more of the details, as you've mentioned. And basically, we know that Israel has dropped no less than 85 bunker-busting bombs, U.S.-made bunker-busting bombs carried by F-35s. Each one weighs 1 ton of explosives, and they were dropped at what is being called as Hezbollah Central Headquarters in Harat Hreik in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Basically, when Benjamin Netanyahu, and we'll talk about that, was in New York, and what we know is most likely he gave his order to the go ahead just a couple of hours after he finished his speech at
after he met with Blinken, Biden, and Harris. Basically, we need to really highlight that, Jamal, is that despite what people are reading in the American press about the kind of tension between the Americans and the Israelis, there's plenty of reporting to suggest that not only did Netanyahu give the order from the United States, from the UN, but he got the blessing of the Biden and Harris administration, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's a very important point.
It's a very important point because there is a big question mark, and this needs to be investigated. Of course, U.S. Defense Secretary Austin said that he basically heard about it when the planes were in the air. And that's what was, I'm paraphrasing his statement, that we weren't notified prior to this operation, but we were told once it was on its way. In other words, there was nothing we could do. And that's when we knew about it. Now, that's the question.
No one believes
about
that.
Timing is like, was it? And
No
Israel
one believes
says
that.
the go-ahead happened. Well, I know that when Benjamin Netanyahu was in New York, and also according to their reports, they said that they knew about it like 3 hours in advance, when Sayyed Hassan Nasrallah was going to be where he was assassinated. So, and they called it a golden opportunity. And then we, of course, will talk about the treachery and spying, the history of spying in Lebanon. And basically, he was betrayed to get this information. This is a sophisticated operation. According to Israeli media, they say they knew the location for many months, and they were like debating whether to assassinate him or not. I mean, that's according to Israeli media, which basically gets information from the Israeli government that they've knew about the location for months, and there were talks about assassinating him or not. And then finally they made that decision. And this was, I mean, it's no coincidence that the decision was made when Benjamin Netanyahu was in New York and was meeting with American officials, and then to come out and say, oh, we didn't know about it. And by the way, one important thing we forgot to mention, and he left with basically $8.7 billion?
More.
Well,
more
I
promises.
think that's what was reported, $8.7 billion approved.
More aid.
Of,
And the bombs dropped.
In
and the bombs
additional
dropped.
US aid, etc.
Right.
So you're telling me, I mean, here's the question, that we've given Israel billions and billions of dollars, and more recently, $20 billion here, $7 billion there, another $8 billion there, and there were no conditions put on Israel. You just give them all the billions of dollars of hard-earned U.S. taxpayers' money, and say, you don't have to coordinate with us. We don't have to know about what you are going to do with our weapons and money.
And you can act illegally. You can go against international law. You can go against the Leahy Act, and you can go against what Biden tried to portray a few months ago, Jamal, if you remember, where he said Biden and Harris are wringing their hands because 2,000-pound bombs were dropped in Gaza, killing hundreds of civilians. The same bombs, U.S.-made bombs, were dropped in Lebanon, in Beirut, killing civilian Lebanese, and an additional $8.2 billion. And we are asked to believe that the United States had no idea about this, Jamal, and that somehow magically, this thing happened and they were completely taken off guard, and it's causing all this tension with Biden and Harris. I have one word for that kind of reporting, which comes from the New York Times, Jamal. It's rubbish. The United States is deeply involved. The intelligence services and Biden and Harris knew about this. Benjamin Netanyahu even told a reporter who asked him if he was going to do this. This is in New York. And you know what his response to a U.S. reporter was when he was asked if they were going to take out Hassan Nasrallah? He said, be patient. This is happening at the United Nations, and we are told to believe somehow that this is a big surprise. And frankly, it's not only unbelievable, but it's complete rubbish. And we've come back to this point many times, Jamal, right? The United States and Israel are lockstep in committing these international crimes against humanity, these war crimes, and are directly cooperating in every step of the way with everything that happens with, with Palestine, with Lebanon, with Yemen, with the entire region. Nobody should believe otherwise, that somehow this is a surprise to the United States. When are we going to stop believing this rubbish?
Well, I don't think anybody believes it. And now we have Israel's Hezbollah machine in the United States and its surrogates in U.S. Congress justifying its operation, saying Hassan Nasrallah is responsible for the death of many people, and so on. And I have to say something about this. Israel so far has killed more than, I think, 1,600 or 1,700 Lebanese. Maybe the number is much higher.
Civilians.
Most of them are civilians, children, women. And we've talked in details about the last massacre they've committed with the pagers. Basically, pagers exploding inside supermarkets and hospitals. And killing ordinary people and killing children and maiming thousands of people. But this is using, again, American technology, which is the bunker buster bombs. And let's assume Hezbollah is wanted by the United States and they have him on the terror list. You are going after to kill few people, Hassan Nasrallah and a few of his aides, and at the same time kill 1,000 people, or you don't care, like 500,000, wherever, drop these bombs and kill innocent civilians, destroy towers, basically, buildings on top of their heads, and this is what happened. They still haven't pulled everybody who was killed down there. So that's the question. The question is the targeting of Palestinian civilians, and which are still dying, because today also Israel attacked, bombed Baalbek in Lebanon. So every day they pick a target, and then every time they bomb, they killed innocent civilians. And you have now more than 1 million Lebanese who are rendered refugees. They're playing the same game with them like they've done in Gaza, telling them to move to safe zones. So the Lebanese in the south are heading north and so forth, and they tell them, vacate this village and that town and move to this area and so forth, and yet they keep killing civilians.
Well, that's exactly right, Jamal. And, this is why it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand the American perspective on this, which is just full support for Israel. Israel does these things, Jamal. It's calculated. It's deliberate. They've made a calculation. They get the full support and backing, not just financially, not just militarily, but we have to really be clear about this. The strategic alliance that the Israeli government and military have to carry out these atrocities, to carry out these assassinations, to carry out these gross violations of international law and crimes against humanity. And it's important because this is something that we've been speaking about for, how many years now, of course, right? But the evidence for this kind of complicity between the United States and Israel is mounting. And I do believe you're right about this. Nobody believes Biden and Harris. Nobody believes the Congress. Nobody believes Secretary Austin, the wringing of the hands. Oh, we didn't know anything about this. The security and intelligence cooperation between the Israelis and the Americans is deep, is something that's been going on for many decades. And my question back to you is that in terms of the destabilization that is going to happen as a result of this assassination and the destruction of civilian infrastructure and civilian deaths in Lebanon, Jamal, what implication do you believe, in terms of your reading of the Arab press right now, what is being said in terms of the next steps that we can anticipate for a region that is already kind of on the precipice of complete fragmentation? What are you hearing from the Arab press right now?
Well, we're seeing it right now. I mean, today Israel is bombing Gaza. They're bombing Baalbek in Lebanon. They're buying Yemen. They bombed Yemen, Hadida, as we're speaking. They've bombed Yemen, and I just want to go back to make a reference to this. Is that exactly in that's like 20 years ago, in 2004? Okay, we are in 2024. Israel assassinated Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was the spiritual leader, the head of Hamas. He was like the Nasrallah for Hamas. That's 20 years ago. They dropped a huge bomb on the building he was at, destroying the building, killing hundreds of civilians and children and women to kill him. They killed, one man. And so what happened in 2023? This is October 7, 2023, almost 20 years to date. That's when Hamas invaded and went inside the Israeli settlements and kibbutzes. Were they able to destroy Hamas? No, they
just the opposite.
They basically created a more powerful Hamas, and people who wanted, because people don't talk about this. They say, oh, everything started on October 7th. And then people say, so October 7th, it's the history of occupation, 1967. And then, of course, you want to take it further down. No, it's since the Nakba, since most of these people who are living in Gaza are originally from indigenous, and they are from historic Palestine, from Haifa, Jaffa, and so forth, who were made refugees. These are the children and their children's children who are fighting today. No one mentions Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of basically Hamas, and who was assassinated almost 20 years ago. Well, 20 years ago, to date. And no one talks about that, right? So this was 20 years ago. So now they've assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, okay? And I'll talk about his presumed successor. Is that going to make things calmer? Do you think that
No.
Hezbollah are going to raise the white flag and they want to sign a peace agreement with Israel and everything's going to go hunky-dory? No.
So here's what's going to happen, Jamal. And this is something that has to be part of the calculation, the American-Israeli calculation. It will only strengthen Hezbollah. It will only promote more recruitment among Lebanese communities to join Hezbollah. It will redouble the commitment to confront Israel and its atrocities and its human rights violations. So the calculation that the Israeli military and government have made in Gaza and now in Lebanon, that they will destroy the infrastructure of Hamas or Hezbollah, is a complete, not only miscalculation, it's delusional, because your analysis about what happened to Hamas after the assassination of Sheikh Hassan is absolutely correct. It recommitted people to resistance and to confront the occupation of historic Palestine. And the thing is, Jamal, that people in Lebanon and people who the Lebanese who do support Hezbollah in terms of its ability to, and let's not forget this, Jamal, it was Hezbollah who kicked out Israel, who defeated Israeli military in Lebanon in the 2000s, and were able to militarily defeat the Israeli military. The only thing that will happen from this, Jamal, is that it will redouble recruitment. It will redouble people's commitment to confronting and joining a resistance to this brutality that the Israeli military and government are happening right now. So we have to really think about this. If you're playing checkers politically, then Benjamin Netanyahu can say, "Oh, I got this little, checker piece because we were able to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah." And you saw this in the Israeli press, right? He was taking, I can't believe they even said this, but they were basically saying Netanyahu took a victory lap after assassinating Hassan Nasrallah and killing so many civilians. It's such a depraved way of thinking about it. But that was a checkers move because he is worried about his own political survival, and he thinks this will help him stay in power. But if you're playing chess instead of checkers, and you're thinking about the long-term consequences for Palestine, for Lebanon, the entire region, this will only serve to undermine U.S. strategic interests in the region, Jamal. It will undermine U.S. security. It will undermine U.S. ability to strategically survive in the region, because this will have a catastrophic long-term consequence, not just for the Israelis, but for the Americans and their influence in the region, which is, obviously waning tremendously. No one believes it. In fact, we don't have time to talk about it today, but it was just announced 24 hours ago that the Americans would be leaving Iraq. Some of the bases that they're occupying, supporting Iraqi military. I mean, it's, they left Afghanistan. Now there's a big vacuum. They're going to leave Iraq. There's going to be a big vacuum. This is really, we're kind of seeing a dramatic shift in the geopolitics of the region, Jamal.
Well, the bottom line, Israel's actions breeds hate. We haven't seen it going any other way. All this mirage about the Abraham Accords and peace treaty. I mean, it was the funny thing that when Benjamin Netanyahu mentioned the Abraham Accord and including Saudi Arabia, the cameras panned at the Saudi Arabia delegation. The seats were empty.
It was empty.
They were empty. I mean, they live in this delusion that by force they can destroy and kill the Palestinians, kill the Lebanese people, and bring people down to their knees to accept them, in the Middle East and sign peace agreements. And they might do that, and they've done that, because that's governments who are dependent on the United States, like the UAE and others. But the populations, they don't want that. You could see it. You could talk about even the average person from Bahrain or wherever. They just don't want to deal with Israel because they know what they've been doing. They've been seeing it on television. And again, this hate that they've been breeding and building in the entire Middle East sadly reflects on the United States. And in fact, a U.S. base in Syria was attacked just yesterday.
Right.
And in Lebanon, there was, we all know the story of what happened to the Marines in Beirut. And that's when Israel invaded Lebanon and created the whole massacres of Sabra and Shatila. And so that reflects on the United States. And then we go around and you go, you could send Secretary Blinken 1,000 times to the Middle East and into these photo ops, and we are, with you, and we stand with the Saudi people, and we stand with the Jordanian people, and so forth, and bilateral relations. It's all
nobody
talk.
believes it.
It's
nobody
all talk.
believes it.
It's
Jamal,
all for show.
Nobody believes them. Nobody believes Blinken. Nobody believes Biden, Harris. No one believes the American military or security apparatus or stance on this. And you are 100% right in terms of how this is going to change the landscape of the entire region for generations and generations to come. If Biden-Harris, if the American administration, if Blinken believes that destroying societies in Palestine, Lebanon, and throughout the Middle East is going to engender love for the United States and support for the United States for future generations, it's not just delusional, Jamal. It's a psychotic belief. But the United States has hitched its wagon to Benjamin Netanyahu. There are people within the Biden administration, and this has been leaked out a little bit, Jamal. There are some advisors to Biden who actually encourage Biden to encourage Netanyahu to do this. And there's some leaks that are coming out about that there's this group in the Biden administration who are advocating for even a stronger and more supportive stance in relation to these atrocities that Israel is committing right now. And we're seeing that group within the Democratic establishment, within the Biden-Harris administration, winning out. It is a checkers move, Jamal. This is not chess. The long-term consequences, together with what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening obviously in the Middle East and beyond, what's happening in Africa, which we haven't talked about recently, in terms of the United States losing ground in terms of its support from African countries and African communities. They're pulling out of bases in Africa right now. So the strategic geopolitical makeup right now, because of Israel, the entire world is unsafe, Jamal. Because of Israel right now, the entire world is in flames. And the idea that there is an international kind of set of laws to govern and to promote stability in the world has been undermined by Israel and nobody else. And the consequences, the difference, again, the difference between checkers and chess, this is going to have a generational impact, not just in the Middle East, but I think in the world. This is really, really a critical historical moment.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.